Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for what will be a fascinating discussion on a topic of such tremendous interest in this space, which is the promise of carbon capture, an area that people have been talking about for a long time. And I think we are going to hear today from experts who will give us real insights on where things currently stand, what are the key economic and policy issues in front of us, what are the technical and technology factors that still apply, and then we'll also take your questions. In fact, I'd like to make sure all of you know that on the right dashboard of your screen, there's a questions bar. If you do have questions, please type them in. The second part of the hour, we'll get to as many as we possibly can. I'm going to turn it over in just a second to my co-host, Amanda Eversole of the American Petroleum Institute, but I also want to acknowledge and thank our partners who have contributed so generously to supporting OEP. You can see them there, and they support our mission of a nonpartisan platform for bringing different voices together to advance the goal of sound energy policy, a goal that we all share. We work closely with people in government and the media to be sure that they get to hear all of these voices, find consensus, find areas of difference. So thanks to all of our partners. I'm now going to turn it over to Amanda, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Petroleum Institute, former senior executive at JP Morgan Chase and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Amanda, thank you for co-hosting today, and it's all yours.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm just so proud of this organization and what you're able to accomplish, and I'm glad to be just a small part of it. At API, the American Petroleum Institute, we represent all segments of America's natural gas and oil industry, and our hundreds of members produce, process, and distribute the majority of our nation's energy. And I would commend to you that we recently released the industry's climate action framework, which you can find on api.org, which includes supporting technologies like carbon captures as a key pillar. Just last week, we unveiled the latest effort in our work to develop sensible approaches on climate, a voluntary climate reporting template that individual natural gas and oil companies can use more consistently to report and track GHG indicators. With those developments and infrastructure negotiations coming to a head in Washington, the timing of today's event is perfect. And I am especially excited to be a co-host and serve on the board. Of course, Bill, you know you didn't have to make a hard sell when you asked me to serve, because I so genuinely value the civil and substantive discourse that our energy policy facilitates. Of course, I think we all agree that climate change poses a major risk, and API and our member companies are poised to play a pivotal role in its solution. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is among the most promising low-carbon innovations, and unsurprisingly, the U.S. is already a world leader in deploying this groundbreaking technology. There is certainly more work to do, and following the CCUS model, America's natural gas and oil industry is laser-focused on scaling existing technologies and developing new ones that will maximize emissions reductions in ways that are both cost-effective for businesses and consumers. With a combination of public and private public policies and industry initiatives, and lots of fast fact-based civil discourse, we can tackle the climate challenge, maintain our nation's economic competitiveness, and prepare the world's long-term energy needs. CCUS puts long-awaited promises into practice. So it bears repeating, policymakers and industry leaders share a vision for a lower carbon future. Clearly, CCUS provides a major opportunity for the public and private sectors to come together, and I look forward to hearing the insights put forth during today's discussion. At this point, it is my privilege to introduce today's distinguished guest speaker. Congressman Dan Crenshaw is serving in his second term. And Bill, I just want to confirm if Congressman Crenshaw is on the line today.
We're expecting him any minute. And I think what we may do is introduce our panel, and as Congressman Crenshaw comes on to deliver some opening remarks, we'll turn it over to him. We are really privileged today to have a phenomenally expert and very diverse panel in terms of perspectives to bring to bear on this topic. So we're going to get to them right away. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Bill Lease, who is the managing partner of Braemar Energy Ventures. And Bill has had a variety of roles in the energy field, a leader in energy innovation for multiple decades. And Bill, thank you very much for joining us as the moderator today.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Our Energy Policy for having me as the moderator. Having made one investment in this area, I'm particularly excited to hear the thought leadership that's being offered by our three panelists. So I'll make very quick introductions. Of course, there's much longer bios for them, but this will just be the short ones. So first we have Lee Beck. Lee Beck is a Clean Air Task Force International Director for Carbon Capture. In this capacity, she co-directs the carbon capture program and leads engagement on U.S. federal carbon capture and CO2 infrastructure policy, as well as the EU carbon capture and removal program. Lee comes to CATF from the Global CCS Institute, where she served as a senior advisor leading the Institute's advocacy efforts in North America. Our next panelist is Ryan Edwards. Ryan is the low carbon policy advisor at Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, working to advance carbon capture utilization and storage. His experience in research spans CCUS science, engineering, economics, and policy. Prior to joining Oxy, Ryan was part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science Congressional and Engineering Fellow in the United States Senate, working on energy and climate policy with a focus on CCUS. And last, not least, Jeremy Harrell. Jeremy is the managing director at ClearPath, where he leads the public policy development and promotion efforts. He specializes in clean energy innovation, financing policies, regulatory reform that accelerate the development and export of cutting-edge technologies. Jeremy also serves as a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Advisory Committee. So we're very fortunate to have these three great thought leaders. I guess we'll just launch into the questions, okay? So the first question is for the whole panel, and again, feel free to jump in as you're comfortable. What is your current thinking on carbon capture and utilization, CCU, versus carbon capture and storage, CCS, as regards each approach in reducing CO2 to levels promulgated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency?
I'm very happy to jump in.
Please, Ryan, go right ahead.
First of all, I guess I'm coming from Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, and for the background on where we're coming into utilization and storage here, Oxy has a really long history as the largest CO2 utilizer and storer in the world. This has been through our CO2 Enhanced Oil Recovery operations, which we've been doing for 40 years in the Permian Basin. And so through that, we inject CO2 into depleted oil fields, which helps produce additional oil. And in the process, that CO2 is permanently geologically stored. And so with that kind of DNA of that background in utilization storage, we launched Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, of which I work for, to really broaden our involvement into the whole CCUS space. We're investing in CCUS technologies, developing projects, and also providing services to help other companies implement their projects. And so what I'll say is that we're pursuing both of these, both utilization and storage, and we think there's a really important role for both. So we're developing dedicated CO2 geologic storage sites where we'll permanently and safely store CO2 very deep below ground. We'll continue our history in CO2 enhanced oil recovery, where we'll replace our existing supply of mined CO2 with captured and removed CO2 to utilize and store that CO2. But also we're investing and very excited about utilization to create products. And so just one example there is a company called Semvita that we've invested in. And what they've done is bioengineer cyanobacteria to produce ethylene, a basic building block, a basic foundation for many plastics and chemicals from CO2 feedstock. It's really exciting. We just announced recently that we're moving forward with a pilot project on that. And I know our team are really excited about the potential of that technology to become cost competitive and better than fossil fuels as a feedstock for making ethylene. So that's kind of the overall space we see there. Exciting. I will say just overall, when we think about utilization versus storage, it's a both, it's an and. You know, we know that we need to capture and store or remove huge amounts of CO2. IPCC, we have to remove 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 this century. IEA say we need 8.6 billion gigatons captured by mid-century each year. We have vast geologic storage capacity for that. And for context in those numbers, the ethylene example I just gave there, that the total global market for ethylene is 160 million tons a year. So orders of magnitude lower. So perhaps a small piece, but some really high value and important pieces in the overall puzzle. And I'll leave it there and see if the others want to weigh in.
Great. Would anybody else like to weigh in on this?
Sure, I'm happy to as well. And for those who may not be familiar with ClearPath, we're an NGO here based in Washington, D.C., focused on clean energy innovation and climate policy. And as we look at the landscape and reducing global emissions, we see and share kind of Ryan's view that both the storage and the utilization side is going to be essential to seeing CCUS take off. And we see CCUS as an essential tool in the toolbox to having any shot of meeting deep emissions reduction goals in the power sector, industrial sector, and even in the transportation sector by a climate relevant time frame. And so we think we need multiple different pathways to see these technologies forward. Not one single project pencils out in the same way. And so in a lot of cases, storage is going to pencil out to make sense, especially here in the US and with the 45Q tax credit, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about later. And on the utilization side, both incentives and providing additional revenue streams for projects as they pencil out. As we've talked to folks on the ground, we see really key opportunities moving forward on the utilization side, and that extends beyond enhanced oil recovery. But we see enhanced oil recovery as probably an imperative in the medium run as we look to reduce emissions and get to the challenge of getting those deep emissions reductions. And I think a huge opportunity as we move forward to pencil out, because I don't think we can meet these deep decarbonization objectives without CCUS carbon capture technologies taking off. And so taking any of those options out of the tool belt, I think it would be a mistake, especially as we're kind of on the precipice of a key moment, particularly here in the US, and as technology deployment is going to ramp up.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump in here and introduce Clean Air Task Force. We're an environmental organization. We started working 25 years ago on reducing emissions from power plants, and now are really focused on the next generation clean energy and decarbonization technologies. So if you look at the International Energy Agency's modeling, 75% of emissions reductions are expected to come from technologies not yet mature. That of course includes renewable energy, but also nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture, hydrogen. Many of these technologies we're working on, not just in the US, but also in Europe and other countries, to really advancing policy frameworks to commercializing these next generation clean energy technologies. From our perspective, Clean Air Task Force, we've been working on carbon capture for more than 10 years. We helped co-found the Carbon Capture Coalition, which is very successful with the biggest policy package ever proposed, now floating in Congress. And I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit. But from our perspective, carbon capture is really an important part to enable each region and country in the world to decarbonize according to its own structural economy. So we don't actually think that we need to prescribe technologies, but we want to make them available and reduce the cost to enable productive industries like cement and steel, but also in the power sector to safeguard jobs and to stay productive, and really enable each region and country to have its unique energy transition. Of course, from our perspective, the importance of carbon capture rises with climate ambition. We've seen this moving the goalposts for net zero from 2070 to 2050 means we will meet twice as much carbon capture. So I think it's really important that we're looking at a responsible but rapid scale up in the near term. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion today. And thank you so much for Our Energy Policy for hosting this.
Great. Okay, so the next question is for Jeremy. Jeremy, what has 45Q tax credit done for the industry thus far? Is there support across the board? And if not, why?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first and foremost, the 45Q tax incentive is the most robust policy lever to accelerate the deployment of CCUS across the globe. And is a key driver here in the U.S. as we see both the bill getting enacted and extended at the end of last Congress, and the IRS's implementation rules announced. We're seeing upwards of 30 to 40 projects in the U.S. that are in various stages of deployment across sectors. So on the fuels production, on the industrial side, and on the power sector side. And that's being overlaid with significant government support that's happening at the Department of Energy, as they've done additional cost share agreements to scope out engineering and design of studies. And ultimately, we expect the administration to launch an ambitious kind of earth shot, is what they're calling, on deploying CCUS and direct air capture technologies, which will be 50-50 cost share agreements to deploy an initial wave of technologies consistent with what was directed by Congress in the big energy package that was enacted last year. 45Q and CCUS policy as a whole is where we're seeing some of the most consensus in Congress right now. We've seen Republicans and Democrats, both on the House and the Senate, pushing to enhance the 45Q tax credit, as they see the math that Lee was just wisely laying out there in her remarks previously, of as we increase the ambition for deep emissions reductions, the need for CCUS becomes even more prevalent. And so we've got proposals from Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives to make the 45Q tax credit permanent or significantly extend it, bipartisan proposals to up the value of the credit, provide some additional flexibility, increase the scope of projects that could qualify for it. And I think it's something the globe is watching. I think the U.S. is ground zero in a good way for CCUS as we're seeing these technologies advance forward. I think we're going to see a massive wave of projects start to move forward, whether it's with government support or partnership or on its own. I think we've got some really exciting private sector driven projects that are going to get announced in the near term as well. And so I'm excited to see how it's developed. It's a really exciting time to be in the space. And I'll tell you, as an organization that's actively engaging on the Hill with Republican and Democrat policymakers, the interest could not be higher on ways that they can help accelerate a future for this technology, because folks really see the key role it can play both in climate and in economic development in this country and abroad.
That's great. So really an area of true bipartisan cooperation across the board. Great.
Yeah, to just jump in and just add a little bit more kind of industry view on top of what Jeremy laid out perfectly and accurately there. From industry's point of view, the 45Q credit, and particularly the Future Act that reformed the initial 45Q credit back in 2018, really has catalyzed the industry and opened the door to being actually able to make this as a business. It's the first time there's really a clear economic incentive for CCUS. And you can see the benefit of that just through Oxy's story, that after the 45Q Future Act became law, that's when we launched Oxy Low Carbon Ventures to go out and make this a business and invest in the technologies, develop the projects. But even in those few years since, our scope's really expanded in Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. Last year, we saw Oxy set a net zero target ambition for both our operations and our products by 2050. And our CEO has been very public, stating that we want to become a carbon management company. And so that kind of chain of events and snowball is what 45Q, frankly, set off. And as Jeremy mentioned, 30, 40 projects publicly announced. I can also say that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. That there's many other projects out there that people are looking at that aren't yet announced. They're in different stages of development. And I think an important note on that too is that 45Q in and of itself is not the end point. It's critical. It's been a great catalyzer and a starting point, but we really do need a strengthened and broadened policy framework to really launch CCUS at the scale we need. And I know we'll talk a bit more about that coming up.
Yep. Okay, well, maybe picking it up from there, Ryan, getting to the more recent legislation. It says there's been a flurry of these bipartisan bills to support the CCUS introduced in recent months, including multiple bills that would reform and enhance the 45Q tax credit, including the Catch Act, the Scale Act, and the Carbon Capture Improvement Act. CCUS is also featured in President Biden's American Jobs Plan proposal. Can you tell us what these bills and proposals would do? Do they form a coordinated plan? What is the current state of play? And what is the outlook for CCUS policy? A lot of questions.
But I'll try and do it succinctly. Short answer is yes. Yeah, there has been this flurry of bills. As Jeremy mentioned, it's amazing because there's really a lot of interest, support for carbon capture right now amongst policymakers. And they do form a kind of coordinated policy framework that's really been developed by stakeholders, including the organizations we have here today, as well as the Carbon Capture Coalition, the Carbon Utilization Research Council, CURC, and of course our congressional supporters and as the administration's laid out in the American Jobs Plan. And so I think the simplest way that I see it is kind of three key pillars or legs of the stool or whatever you want to call it of policy support for CCUS. And the proposals that are out there fit into these buckets, and they're all essential to work with each other to create a supportive environment to launch this industry. And so we have research, development, and deployment, getting the new technologies out there, deploying the initial projects. Then we have the bucket of incentives and project financing to enable companies to go actually do these projects and then build projects. And then we have the infrastructure bucket, the backbone infrastructure to be able to actually transport, move CO2, and then store it geologically underground. And so going through those buckets, R&D and deployment, DOE have an amazing and really successful long history in CCUS research, development, and deployment. This was expanded, their authorization in the Energy Act at the end of last year. And then we're seeing proposals, including in Chairman Manchin's energy infrastructure discussion draft, that'll be in the mix of discussions for upcoming infrastructure bills. That includes, appropriations to really implement and scale those programs and scale DOE's involvement in technology and in helping demonstrate these technologies. And then on the incentives and project financing bucket, we've already spoken about the key there. That's the 45Q tax credit is really the bedrock here. And there's been several different bills doing different things to reform and enhance that credit. But overall, I'd say there's kind of two things they're doing. One is just making it easier to use the credit, and that's through direct pay. The current default of how to use the credit is you've got to monetize that through taxable income the corporation has to offset. That's really difficult for any corporation to know they've got 12 years of taxable income coming down to be able to commit to invest in those credits. So typically you have to monetize those through tax equity partnerships, which are really complex and difficult. And so enabling direct pay, which just opens up financing to the whole global capital pool really, is really critical to make sure that these projects can be financed, especially in a timely way. And then the other bucket of things that's happening with 45Q is increasing the value for new applications that are currently higher cost. Carbon capture is a really, this is one of its great points and versatility, is it's a really broad family of applications and technologies. But what that also means is that there is no one size or value for the credit that fits everything. And so policy starting to recognize that with proposals to enhance the value of 45Q for direct air capture. That's critical if we want to launch direct air capture that we know we're going to need to remove carbon over this century. And also for industrial capture, things like cement that carbon capture is absolutely essential to decarbonize is going to need a higher credit to get going. Finally, the final bucket is infrastructure, and we've got the SCALE Act. This act would set up federal programs that will help finance CO2 transport and storage infrastructure and really tackle what I'd say is a really big chicken and egg problem the industry currently has, that we want to develop carbon capture projects, but to be able to do that, you need to be able to transport and store your CO2. At the same time, to be able to build that infrastructure, you need projects that are going to use the infrastructure. So the SCALE Act is really designed at addressing that issue, and all those pillars working together really reinforce each other. Are really important that all of them happen to make this work. And so I'll leave it there. As the current state, these plans have been introduced. They're in the American Jobs Plan. So we'll really be looking towards the upcoming potential bipartisan infrastructure package and clean energy tax packages, several opportunities to really implement this framework.
That's great.
Yeah. And I will jump in here. I think it's really, this was a fantastic overview, of course, but it's really important to recognize that innovation policy is not one and done. So if we're looking at 45Q, was first passed in 2018, and then we had more than 40 projects announced, even more, many of them that are not public yet. That shows how much interest there is in deploying this technology. So when we at the Clean Air Task Force looked at potential policies to build on this and really expand this impact, this is the policies that we collectively as a group of advocacy organizations and companies came up with. And so I think this is really important to recognize that if we make these incremental improvements to these policies, plus at the SCALE Act, then according to our own analysis, we could have a 13-fold scale up of carbon capture and store carbon management capacity in the United States in the mid-2030s, effectively constituting something close to large-scale deployment. And so it's really important for us to emphasize this potential impact of these policies. I do also want to point to a Clean Air Task Force fact sheet that's on our website called Scaling Up Climate Ambition, Carbon Capture, Removal, and Storage Priorities in the 117th Congress, which really outlines where the different policies have impact in the carbon capture value chain, because it's a very complex value chain, as Ryan already explained. And then, of course, the last thing that I think is really, really important, that these are carefully curated policies that are supported by environmental organizations. We heard from Jeremy and Ryan enjoy bipartisan support, but also very important, have a lot of labor support. So this is a really kind of long standing effort to develop these policies, and so they constitute the largest proposed investment by any government ever put forward by a government. And so we, of course, love to see them pass this Congress to make sure that we can enable the scale up of carbon capture, removal, and storage technologies as soon as possible.
Yeah, and Bill, just to jump in real quickly here at the end, as the resident political hack here, I think the prospects are really good over the next year and a half. We see a pathway for a variety of these policies, regardless of how the politics play out over the next couple months. I think a really, really strong signal that Senator Manchin and Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana have made CCUS a central component of their push in this bipartisan infrastructure package, where I think we could see the injection of billions of new resources into the Department of Energy to execute those cost share programs we discussed earlier. The SCALE Act is part of that. So there's really strong bipartisan support for all of that type of work. And then on the tax side, I think we could see enhancements for 45Q either move forward in a reconciliation bill, which, for those who aren't in the middle of the DC realm, with the one operational path forward that the congressional Democrats can take, since they're in control of the House and the Senate, to move bills alone. I think those bills could move that way. And then, as we talked about earlier, there's strong bipartisan support for 45Q as a whole. And so should that not be the path forward, I could see a tax package at the end of this Congress, so sometime next year, or even getting included in a bipartisan deal later on in the Congress. And so we're really optimistic. We think that sends a really important market signal to the private sector as they look to invest in these technologies. We're getting an influx of the financial community wanting to talk through these technologies. And as Ryan and Lee both kind of articulated, on the application side, we're seeing more and more, the US steel industry, which is now set net zero targets, wanting to lean in and partner on these projects. This is not just an oil and gas technology. It goes across the realm. Cement technologies moving forward. And so it's a really exciting time. And I think the politics here are going to play out well over the next 18 months, and people should stay tuned.
That's great. It's so nice to hear the enthusiasm and how well even with maybe some challenges left to make sure the enactments are done, that there's just general support across the board on both parties. It's very, very exciting. So this is for Lee. Lee, we've been seeing more and more of these CCUS project and policies being announced globally, especially in Europe. What is the current state of play, and how does the US compare globally in deployment policy?
Yeah, thank you so much for this great question. As Jeremy already pointed out, the US government has done more than any other government in the world to commercialize these technologies. And currently there are 12 operating carbon capture facilities across the United States, more than in any other country. And of course, there's a lot of appetite, but what we're seeing across the world is really that climate ambition is driving the realization that carbon capture is needed. And so what we're seeing, particularly in Europe, is a private sector interest driven by government support. So we just recently, Clean Air Task Force just recently launched a European carbon capture and storage activity tracker. We have the same also in the US, so feel free to take a look at all the projects that have been announced. But what we saw is that we've seen more than 40 projects announced in 13 different European countries. This includes blue hydrogen, carbon capture for cement and steel, waste to energy. So really exciting movements over the past 2 years. But most importantly, we've seen two governments each invest more than $2 billion or commit to investing $2 billion in CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. That's one, the Norwegian government with the Northern Lights project, which will start with a carbon capture facility at a cement plant, potentially also a waste to energy plant, and with offshore storage in the North Sea. The project already is making preparations to expand and is talking to companies all over Europe, dozens of companies all over Europe, potentially becoming really the first large-scale European decarbonization projects in the carbon capture realm. And then, of course, the Dutch government just a few weeks ago agreed to invest upwards of 2 billion euros into the Porthos project, the Port of Rotterdam carbon capture project, which will collect, again, CO2 from multiple sources and store it in the North Sea. We're also seeing multiple projects on the list of projects of common interest with similar models, CO2 transport and storage, to collect from multiple sources of CO2, really applying for government support. And I think this is really, really important. These are large-scale landmark projects that are going to catalyze carbon capture and storage across Europe. So while we're of course seeing all this activity in the US, Europe is making large strides towards the commercialization of carbon capture. That being said, I think the US has much more experience with deployment-oriented policies. 45Q, again, is the most progressive carbon capture specific incentive, as Jeremy pointed out. And so our Clean Air Task Force is really interested in enabling a transatlantic dialogue where we're kind of providing different perspectives on how to optimize policy incentives to provide blueprints for countries to commercialize carbon capture, removal, and storage technologies. And certainly the US experience will be incredibly important from that perspective. I'll stop here. I will say the European Union, there's much policy revision coming up over the next 2 weeks. So I would suggest to just stay tuned for what's going to happen next on the policy front there.
Great, thank you. If anyone cares to comment about the European side of it, I think what we'll do is we'll go to the next question, which is around technologies. We started talking about this earlier. So newer technologies often face barriers to rapid deployment and commercialization. And these challenges are shared by CCUS, are these challenges shared by CCUS technology? And if so, how can they be overcome? So, I, as a venture capitalist, see a lot of issues around technologies and infrastructure. But in this particular case, are there certain technology risks that are particularly need addressing before we can get to the commercial stage that are significant?
I'm happy to start. I think my quick answer to that would be we're at the doing stage on CCUS. So we've got a wide array of technologies that have been deployed globally across a wide variety of different applications. So whether it's power plant applications, industrial applications, blue hydrogen production, things along those lines. And so we're at the stage here in this technology space that scale up is what's going to do the most to drive down the cost and ultimately let us see as I think the webinar is aptly titled, the long promise that CCUS could provide. And so I think that's why we're so excited about the state of play right now. These 30, 40 plus projects, which as Ryan aptly points out, I think is just the tip of the iceberg. Just here in the US, there are a wide variety of global projects that Lee pointed out that I think are really exciting, and there's important learnings. And the people who are deploying these are big global energy companies, whether it's Oxy, I think Equinor is going to be making some interesting new announcemements here in the US on the blue hydrogen side here soon. And other of those big players, I think we're excited to see that move forward. And so that's why these policies that we've been talking about, the 45Q tax incentive, building out infrastructure that the SCALE Act can unlock, things along those lines, let us truly scale this technology, because that's where we're going to see the huge cost declines as we truly more widely deploy this technology across the applications it can serve.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything Jeremy just said. 100%. I guess I could add a little bit more nuance that because CCUS is such a diverse space, there are, you've got right from the scale of technologies that have literally been deployed commercially for 100 years, carbon capture technologies, to very early stage new types of way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So there is a big spectrum, and we do need to continue on all parts of the policy spectrum of supporting the initial technologies, supporting the initial large-scale deployments of technologies, and as Jeremy said, the way we really get this to a real industry with low costs is scale, which is no coincidence of why the Scale Act is named the Scale Act. It's so crucial that we achieve that scale. And as to what how can they be overcome? It is hard to develop, especially the first large-scale projects of any technology. Even if the technology is pretty well vetted, there's still that uncertainty. It's still the first time. You still got to get financiers comfortable with this. So there are always challenges and an initial higher cost just because it hasn't done before. The supply chains for that aren't fully optimized yet. And so that's why this policy framework we've been talking about really is important to address all parts of that. You've got kind of the DOE support for the initial large-scale demonstrations of those projects to really help address those first challenges of deploying something at scale. You've got the project financing piece of 45Q to make sure that these are financeable and can become businesses. And then you've got the infrastructure to solve the chicken and egg and create more and more places, literally more and more places where you can build these projects. And so it's all important together and all works together in enabling all of this.
Okay. So it sounds like we have all the components to get to scale in the making, and now we've got to go and execute with all this legislation pending and the various constituencies that are supporting it. So technology barriers are really not that big in the CCUS space, is what I'm kind of hearing collectively. So, okay, this is for Lee. Lee, what are the cost trends of carbon capture technologies?
Thank you so much for this question. I love this question because it's just, there's no, single answer, because there's, of course, as we already heard, no single carbon capture technology or application. Each of these plants are different. We have a wide range of different applications and technologies. So, I mean, the rule of thumb that we say is that the higher the concentration of the CO2 in the flue gas stream, the cheaper and less costly it is. So it can start with natural gas processing, fertilizers, ethanol, which have very pure streams of CO2 at around $10, and then goes up as the flue gas streams is more complex for cement. Power around $50 a ton, but again, very unique. So I think what's really important to highlight is that at Clean Air Task Force, we don't like to talk about the cost of per ton of CO2 reduced. First of all, there's multiple ones. It's not an apple-to-apple comparison between technologies. So we really want to highlight the importance of policy and, as Jeremy said, learning by doing to reduce costs. If we're looking at solar, for example, 90% of the cost reductions were achieved by learning by doing, by actually deploying the technologies, 10% through incremental R&D. And if we're looking at carbon capture facilities, there were, of course, analyses done. If we're building a second one of the first of a kind we've already built, we could achieve, up to 30% cost reductions from everything that we're learning and the efficiencies that we're achieving. Shared CO2 transport and storage facilities will be incredibly important to achieve economies of scale. And from our perspective, we also need to take a look at overall system costs. Why is carbon capture important within a system of decarbonization technologies? Because it helps us to keep overall decarbonization costs low. And then, of course, as Ryan already mentioned, we need to focus on reducing the cost of capital by reducing risk and making sure that these technologies have access to affordable financing. And this, again, the key to unlocking all of these learning by doing cost reductions and reducing the cost of capital is through the policy mechanisms that we've already described. So while I want to give a more specific answer, it's not that easy. I will refer to the Global CCS Institute's reports on cost of carbon capture that has been recently reissued, I think in April, and is on the website free of charge.
That's a great report. Global CCS Institute. Google it now. It's a good report. I just want to hone in on one thing Lee said about looking at the overall system-wide cost. And instead of asking the question, I don't think the question, what is the cost of carbon capture, is that interesting. The question is, what's the cheapest way to get to a clean energy system? And when you look at it from that frame, carbon capture is extremely competitive right today for many ways to get clean products, clean energy, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And as Lee described, and Jeremy's described, there's real pathways to even bring those costs significantly going in the future. So I think, yeah, that's just a real question, and that's exactly the reason, because we know that answer, is why carbon capture comes out as such a critical part of every system-wide analysis by the IEA, by the IPCC about how we get to net zero. It's a reason why a company like Oxy is pursuing this and investing in it, because we know that's true.
Great. Okay. Going back to you, Ryan, again. You started talking about technologies earlier specific to what Oxy's doing, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is doing. You mentioned something in the area of synthetic biology is one really interesting area. Do you care to comment about a few others that you're excited about and that the company's excited about?
Happy to, and I'll keep it short. So as I said, Oxy, we're both investing in new technologies for CCUS as well as deploying projects. Just a few highlights. I'll talk about direct air capture. So direct air capture, I think, has been certainly increasing awareness and appreciation of how key it's going to be to develop the ability to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at large scale over this century to meet climate targets. And direct air capture is a key technology in that overall space of carbon removal, in that it is very scalable and can provide very verifiable additional removal. So a really important technology. And so Oxy has invested in direct air capture through the company Carbon Engineering, which some of you may have heard of, a Canadian company who's developed a direct air capture technology. We invested in them in 2019, and then in the time since, we've launched 1.5, another good website to look up, 1.5, as the development company to go and deploy these projects. We've announced that we're going to build the first large-scale direct air capture project in the world that will remove 1 million tons of CO2 from the air every year. For context, the biggest direct air capture project to date is something like 2,000 tons per year. So this is a really, really huge scale up. We've announced that we're partnering with Worley, the big global engineering services company, to do the engineering design for that. It's underway now. And we expect that we'll get construction underway late next year with startup in 2025. So it's really exciting as a new technology and the first large-scale deployment of a technology we know we need for reaching net zero. Just quickly, I did mention Semvita. I'll just touch on that again. Now utilization technology, something completely different, but really exciting. Taking CO2, the CO2 we capture or remove from the air, and then using that as a feedstock to create ethylene. And from that, all sorts of products, polyethylene, plastics, et cetera, et cetera. Another one in the electricity sector, and again, the fact that all these are in different complete sectors of the economy is showing how versatile and carbon capture is. Netpower is a technology we've invested in. Netpower is a new electricity generation technology using a new type of power cycle called the Allen cycle, which inherently captures all of its CO2 without any additional capture equipment on the back end, just by the design of the power cycle to use oxygen with natural gas and use the CO2 produced as the working fluid to generate electricity. Extremely exciting technology. Netpower recently announced their first 2 commercial projects for Illinois and Colorado that they expect will be operational by 2025, I believe. And finally, something that's not so much in the technology space, but I think a really important project that we're working on is developing CO2 storage hubs. So as Jeremy's mentioned, the way we do this is we scale. That's how we get to low cost. And so we're working on developing the storage hubs that'll take CO2 from emitters. We specialize in the subsurface and moving the CO2, and we'll pull CO2 captured from a number of different industries to get that cost right down by achieving those economies of scale, and we'll handle the safe and permanent storage of the CO2. So looking at a number of different sites around the US to start with, I think that's also a really important, exciting endeavor.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I have more questions for you, but Kevin, I wondered if this is where we do a time check on opening questions to the audience.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you to all our panelists. This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. We will move to Q&A at this point, so if you do have any questions for our panel here, please feel free to enter it in your chat box on the right-hand side of your screen there. Moving to the questions, first question is from Brian Colby, and thinking about the 45Q tax credit, which we discussed earlier. Should the 45Q tax credit apply proportionally to all removal technologies and new net zero emission generating infrastructure? So to paraphrase that a little bit, should this be applied equally across the board, or do you see different ways in applying this tax credit?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation that's happening here in Washington, D.C. at the moment. And so, you know, as Ryan mentioned earlier, and Lee mentioned when we were talking about cost, like, you know, carbon capture doesn't fit in one singular bucket. The cost to deploy the technology and a cost per ton calculus is very different depending on the calculus, on the actual application. So, you know, petrochemicals can be significantly more expensive than concrete applications, for example, or ammonia application production or ethanol production. And so the administration in their budget proposal, the Biden administration proposed kind of bifurcating the incentive across application. That is something that could make sense, especially if you were willing to take the credit to a higher level for some of these harder to abate sectors. So there are certain applications that, you know, probably need to get over $100 a ton to ultimately move forward, if the 45Q incentive is the only thing that is bridging the gap on the financial side, which I don't think is going to be the case either, as you're hearing about these other incentives. But, you know, as we move forward, you know, the current proposals before Congress, at least, are really focused on the end use of the CO2, upping the credit for a certain level if it's for direct air capture purposes, which is, you know, a higher cost and more nascent stage technology, a certain increase for whether if the CO2 is used for saline storage, and then a certain level for enhanced oil recovery. And I think it's important to point out that there's bipartisan support for upping the incentive kind of across those CO2 end uses or CO2 applications.
Thank you for that. Next question here is more of a technology question from Ray Watson. What are the economics for utilizing captured CO2 in the manufacture of low carbon synthetic fuels? Is this viable?
Ryan, do you want to take it, or should I take it?
Hey, go ahead.
I mean, I think it's an uphill battle. I'm not saying I'm against it, but I think it's an uphill battle because the current cost of taking CO2 into a fuel is, you know, it's challenging to thermodynamics. So while I don't believe it shouldn't be there, I think it should be. I think it's a longer term way to make value out of CO2. That's my personal view, and based on my only looking into the marketplace as a venture investor. But I'd be very interested to hear what Ryan has to say also.
Yeah, I'm no expert on the specific costs of every technology. My understanding is similar to what William just described. What I would say is there's a diverse range of pathways to create net zero liquid fuels that involve carbon capture that aren't necessarily using the CO2 as a feedstock. So we've seen several projects announced now that would take waste woody biomass or municipal solid waste and use that as a feedstock to convert to liquid fuels, where carbon capture forms a really key part of that in capturing the process emissions during the process. And by doing that, you take the overall carbon intensity from something positive but better than gasoline to negative in some cases. Using that fuel actually removes in net CO2 from the atmosphere, which is pretty cool. Another pathway that we're pursuing at Oxy is through CO2 enhanced oil recovery. I described that we had the largest CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations in the world. And so when we pair that with direct air capture, we can remove CO2 from the air, use that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, so inject it into depleted oil fields, produce more oil out of that field, and that CO2 remains permanently stored. And when you look at the whole life cycle there, we can put more CO2 into the ground than actually comes out embedded in the oil. So while that is actually producing a conventional hydrocarbon, the net life cycle is 0 or below. That's technically possible. And because we're not doing the actual uphill thermodynamic conversions that got mentioned there, that could be a scalable and cheaper way to produce a net zero fuel. So I'd say it's early. There's a number of different pathways, but carbon capture really shows up and utilization in a number of those pathways for producing net zero fuels.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Next question here is from Maggie Lynn. What is the current cost of CCUS in the US? What is the projection for 2030 and beyond?
Lee, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, I will repeat again what we said earlier. There's not a single cost, and it's, costs are expected to come down by 2030. The question will be how much of carbon capture will we have deployed to harvest these learnings by doing some cost reductions. So I think at Cleaner Task Force, we think, early on, the cost reductions will be relatively large, first through third of a kind, potentially 30% per plant. And then, of course, the learning rate will be smaller going forward. And there could be potentially costs could fall by half with large scale deployment. But again, I think it depends on what applications, where it will be, how close to transport and storage, how much transport and storage will be commercialized and built. What we can say is costs will come down with deployment.
Thank you, Lee.
One thing that I'll reiterate out there as well, and by no means, and ClearPath comes out of this from a fiscally conservative standpoint. I'm not going to say that costs aren't a significant factor, but especially when you're looking on the industrial sector, if our goal is decarbonization, there are not alternatives to making certain products in the world in a low carbon way without CCUS. And so in the power sector, there is a little bit more of an either or type question that comes about. How does CCUS play a role instead of advanced nuclear or renewables or energy storage or enhanced geothermal systems, things along those lines? In the industrial sector, there aren't many alternatives. There are a couple ideas to electrify steel making, for example, but they haven't really been commercially proven. And as we look at trying to reduce industrial emissions on a climate relevant time frame, CCUS is going to be essential. And so we need to absolutely drive down the cost of those technologies to see it scale up. But it's also a national imperative to ensure our U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. We are always going to be producing building materials, steel, metals, concrete, things along those lines. And so it's a competitiveness and an economic growth imperative as well to see this technology advance and move forward if we are both going to grow economically and tackle the climate challenge.
And again, we've all mentioned this already. To jump on to Jeremy's great point there, in the industrial sector, we know it's imperative. Again, the question, there is a cost. We want to bring the cost down. But when you flip the question to how much does adding carbon capture add to the cost of the end product? Because at the end of the day, what we want is the end product that industrial process makes in a clean way. It's more modest than when you're just thinking about tons per CO2, right? The actual end, when you look at many products, the end cost that it would increase the product by is more modest. And as we bring it down, there's definitely a pathway to make that very competitive.
Yeah.
And if I may marry the answers of this question and the last question about fuels and carbon capture, the role of carbon capture in fuel and industrial decarbonization, I think what's underappreciated in the United States decarbonization conversation is something that has totally taken off and is, as people say, all the rage in Europe, and that's carbon capture for the production of hydrogen. And just want to reiterate that the United States is in a fantastic position to commercialize hydrogen or blue hydrogen. Cleaner Task Force, again, doesn't really like the color coding of hydrogen. We like low carbon hydrogen. for decarbonization because of course, vast natural gas resources, cheap natural gas resources, and this expertise in carbon capture and storage. And so I think it is timely for policymakers also to think now how to kickstart the hydrogen economy through commercializing carbon capture technologies or steam methane reforming, autothermal reforming of natural gas, and really ensuring that we're decarbonizing fuels for use in these end-use sector, in the industrial sector, heavy-duty trucking, shipping, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much.
And I'll throw in there and reiterate, just to clarify on my previous conversation, I'm still excited about power sector applications as well. And Ryan mentioned Netpower, for example, and that's a technology that we are watching really closely that we're excited about. And Netpower, is shooting for, and there is a line of sight to being competitive with traditional combined cycle natural gas. And that would be game breaking, right? If you had a zero emission gas generation facility that was even in the ballpark of a traditional combined cycle natural gas facility, that could pay huge dividends for power sector decarbonization here in the US and across the globe.
Thank you all. Looks like we do have time for one, maybe two more questions. We've had a few come in, so I'm going to paraphrase here and kind of ask one question that touches on commercialization as a whole. Basing on a question from Daniel Shawhan, are cost and technical viability the largest hurdle for commercializing CCUS projects, or are politics and other factors a larger hurdle?
I'll start. I don't think politics is the largest hurdle towards doing a project. I think it's the economic case. The economic and the financing has to be there, and that's why we're talking about this policy package that makes sure that that's there. There's many different aspects to this question, but also the chicken and egg challenge. To be able to finance a project, but to be really able to build a number of projects, we need the infrastructure to enable them. But for that, you need the projects. So that's a very practical infrastructure reason that makes it hard to do projects that we need to address. But yeah, there has to be an economic incentive to do these projects.
And of course, there's the lack of comprehensive climate policy in the United States. That being said, comprehensive climate policy won't be the sole reason of deployment of these technologies. So what Ryan just laid out is really important to make sure we're commercializing the technologies, we're bringing down the costs, we're making sure that once at some point, hopefully there will be sooner, as soon as possible, comprehensive climate policy in the form of carbon pricing, clean energy standards. But to enable carbon capture to contribute within such a comprehensive policy framework, we need to make sure to commercialize the technology so they can actually then essentially or at some point be deployed by these more comprehensive drivers. So this is really, really important to understand that, of course, we need comprehensive climate policy, but it can't replace innovation policy to ensure that we're reducing the costs and making sure we can actually deploy these technologies. So from Cleaner Task Force, this is really the theory of change that we're aiming for, because from our perspective, making these technologies available will also create a more politically amenable environment for more climate ambition and more comprehensive climate policy.
So on that note, which I think is a very forward-looking and very kind of comprehensive view of how we approach this whole space, I want to thank everyone. We could certainly go on for a long time on this, and this was a fascinating conversation with a lot of great insights into such a critical area, and one that I think has been on people's minds for a long time about where the impact is going to be, how significant it will be, and really thanks to all of you for shedding such light. I do want to mention to our audience, our apologies. Congressman Crenshaw had some technical difficulties in joining. We're going to hope to have him on a subsequent webinar, but we're sorry that he wasn't able to join us today, but we will certainly get his views at a future time. Finally, I also want to point all of you to our program that is the resource area of the OEP site, Our Energy Library. It's the most comprehensive library of reports, studies, articles, everything energy policy related, and very easily indexed, curated to help you in the work you're doing. We encourage all of you to go there. There are resources actually listed on your dashboard now, specifically on the CCUS topic, but you can really find issues on every energy policy issue there. So we encourage you to take advantage of that service that we provide. Thanks so much to Jeremy, Lee, Ryan, Bill for your insightful, really stimulating comments and conversation today. To Amanda, my co-host in API, thank you again to our partners for your support, and most of all to all of you out there in our audience for joining us today and taking the time to be with us. And we encourage you to be on the lookout for our webinars coming up in future weeks. Have a great 4th of July to everyone. Hope everyone is feeling well, vaccinated, and able to go out and enjoy the holiday weekend. Thanks again. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for a great discussion.
Yep.
Thank you so much.